Chapter 20, From Smoke-Filled Rooms to Prairie Wildfire, 1877 to 1896. So this is the time period we're focusing on, and much of this chapter has to do with party politics, what life was like for African Americans after Reconstruction, some of the leaders that rose up within the black community to try to fight for better rights for African Americans. So that's what we're looking at in chapter 20. So in the post-Reconstruction era, Congress really ascended to power. And the reason for that is that there was a succession of really weak presidents that occupied the White House. So it really created a power vacuum for Congress to come in and dominate the government. Within Congress, it was generally the Senate that overshadowed the House. Critics said that the Senate was like a rich man's club, but its real source of power and influence came from the tenure that many of its members had and from the small number of senators that had such power. This perception was also in part created by the fact that the House of Representatives was one of the most disorderly and inefficient legislative bodies in the world at this time. And in one account, there was a reporter who came in and observed and said that representatives had newspapers out with their feet up on their desks. The smell of tobacco and alcohol lingered in the room. Everyone talked over the Speaker of the House. So the Senate was really powerful during this time because there were fewer senators than there were representatives, but also because the House of Representatives was so slack, I guess, during this time. So Democrats and Republicans were competing fiercely, but they never really took clear opposing positions on the issues of the day. The main division with Democrats and Republicans was still sectional. You had the Republicans in the North and the Democrats in the South, and that was, of course, a result of the Civil War. The rest of the country, you've got the Southeast Democratic, New England Republican, but the rest of the country was split, although the Republicans tended to have the advantage in the rest of the country. Wealthy Northerners and blacks tended to be Republicans. Immigrants and Catholics tended to be Democrats. And even though the Democrats won the presidency only twice, in that time period, most presidential elections in the late 19th century were really close. And even within Congress, the congressional majorities fluctuated continually. Okay, so what were the recurrent issues of the day? The first one is called the bloody shirt, the quote-unquote bloody shirt. And this refers to the fact that the Republicans continued to attack the Democrats by reminding voters that it had been the Democrats that had seceded, and it was the Democrats that denied rights to blacks in the South, and in essence, it was the Democrats who caused the Civil War because of secession. So that's been called the bloody shirt. Another main issue of this time, Union veterans formed the Grand Army of the Republic, or the GAR, and the purpose of that group was just to lobby for benefits for veterans, and they were actually pretty successful in doing that. Another recurrent issue was tariffs. Tariffs tax imports, usually cheaper imports, meaning the Americans will buy imports unless there's a tariff. And the economists wanted to get rid of tariffs, but the business owners wanted to keep protective tariffs so that people would buy American goods. Another issue, currency reform. The government was faced with major debts that it could not pay after the war, and the greenbacks didn't really inspire confidence like gold and silver did. So after the war, many people wanted to return to bullion, to paying for everything with gold and silver instead of dollars. There was even a greenback party and a greenback labor party. Another one was civil service reform. And At this time, the government grew and they were taking on more functions. Federal employees grew from 53,000 to 256,000 between 1871 and 1900. So, in just about a 30-year period, I mean, that's massive growth, 53,000 to 256,000. And politicians pretty much dispensed jobs without regard for any qualifications. So people wanted government jobs distributed on the basis of merit or ability. So civil service reform was another big issue of this time. So party politics, sidestepping the issues. On the national level, again, the South was Democratic, New England and the Trans-Mississippi West were pretty hardcore Republican. And so usually it was like New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois that would determine the outcome of an election. In fact, there were only 3 presidential candidates between 1868 and 1900 that did not come from one of those states, and all 3 of them lost. So these are what we call swing states. And partisan politics was intense in these swing states because the candidates depended on the votes of those states to win an election. And because so much depended on those states, the level of political ethics was abysmally low. And so to not anger one side or the other, they would sidestep the main issues. Lackluster presidents, Hayes to Harrison. These are all presidents who their names don't really stand out because they didn't really accomplish very much. Presidents during this time demonstrated very little interest in dealing with the urgent issues that were confronting the nation. So we've got Rutherford B. Hayes. He was in office from 1877 to 1881. He was elected because he had a distinguished personal and political record, seemed to be an upstanding citizen, not much corruption or anything like that. He favored sound money, he wanted civil service reform, and he wanted better treatment for blacks in the South. Unfortunately, he didn't really make any progress in any of those areas. All of those are good things, but he didn't really make any progress in those areas. So he was a one-termer. And then in 1880, in the election of 1880, there was a split in the Republican Party between what was called the stalwarts and the half-breeds. The stalwarts and half-breeds. Okay, so the stalwarts adamantly opposed Hayes's reconciliation with the South. They thought that Hayes was being too lenient with the South. And then the half-breeds, in the eyes of the stalwarts, they were only half Republican because they went along with Hayes's lenient treatment of the South. So, derogatory terms, this party split, and James Garfield emerged as like a compromise candidate. Garfield was assassinated after only 4 months in office, but even in that 4 months, he had demonstrated that he was pretty ineffective. His successor was Chester Arthur, and Chester Arthur, on a personal level, was a competent guy. He was honest, but he had been a defender of the spoils system. We talked about the spoils system with Jackson. Again, a practice where a political party, after winning an election, gives away government jobs to its supporters, friends, relatives, as a reward for working toward victory, and as an incentive, really, to keep working for the party. And this is opposed to like the merit system, where offices are given on the basis of political activity or ability. So that kind of tarnished his record a little bit, but Arthur, as president, did conduct himself with dignity. He handled patronage matters with restraint, and he gave nominal support to civil service reform. He also favored regulation of the railroads, tariff reductions. He was still considered a political failure, though, And the stalwarts would not forgive Arthur for his quote-unquote desertion, and the reformers would not forget his past as a defender of the spoils system. So the party denied his nomination in 1884. So he finished out Garfield's term, and that was it. So the election of 1884 revolved around personal issues and was characterized by crazy mudslinging on both sides. So the contenders in this election were Grover Cleveland, who was the former Democratic governor of New York, and James Blaine. And this was a close election. Cleveland defeated Blaine by about 20,000 or less than 25,000 votes. Cleveland, again, an honest guy, but he had a pretty unimaginative administration. He emphasized strict separation of powers, but that prevented his placing effective pressure on Congress. So he failed to confront any of the issues of the day like the other presidents we've already mentioned. So in 1888, Benjamin Harrison, this is the grandson of William Henry Harrison. He was a Republican from Indiana, defeated Cleveland. So Cleveland was a one-termer. So Harrison was actually a fiscal conservative. He would have been for the government keeping their hands off economic policies. Yet while he was president, Congress raised the tariff to an all-time high. They passed the Sherman Antitrust Act and the Silver Purchase Act. And Harrison, through the whole thing, sort of just remained aloof through that whole process. And so in the next election, Cleveland reclaimed his presidency from Harrison, and this would be in 1892. And so he served 2 terms, but they were not consecutive terms. African Americans in the South. And this is, of course, in the post-Reconstruction era. Both Republicans and Democrats subscribed to hypocritical statements about black equality and constitutional rights. Neither one of those sides really did anything to implement the new amendments that had been put into place. For a while, Southern blacks weren't totally disfranchised, meaning they didn't completely lose the right to vote. But over time, you have white political factions that rose up in the South that tried to manipulate black voters. And then in the 1890s, Southern states began to use poll taxes and literacy tests to keep blacks from voting. There were also 2 setbacks for African Americans after the Reconstruction era in the Supreme Court. There were 2 decisions that curtailed black civil rights and the power of the government to defend them. And the first one, it's called the Civil Rights Cases. And it took place in 1883. And in the civil rights cases, the court declared that the Civil Rights Act of 1875 was unconstitutional. And even though the 14th Amendment guaranteed the civil rights of Africans against invasion by the state, it did not guarantee their rights against invasion by the individual. So what that boiled down to was private businesses could refuse services to blacks. And then in 1896, there was the Plessy versus Ferguson case, and this upheld the legality of separate public accommodations for blacks and whites, so long as those accommodations were of equal quality. And if you've seen pictures or looked at that at all, the black accommodations and the white accommodations were far from equal. So that brings us to Booker T. Washington. And some blacks during this time responded to racism and discrimination by adopting a militant black nationalism. Some even advocated an African colonization movement or revival of the African colonization movement, but neither of those approaches won many supporters. And so the dominant black leader of this time was Booker T. Washington, and he believed that blacks needed to accommodate themselves to white prejudices, at least for the time being, and just concentrate on self-improvement. And these ideas were expressed in his Atlanta Compromise speech, and it established his reputation as a moderate, a reasonable black leader. So in public, He minimized the importance of civil and political rights, but behind the scenes, he did lobby against discriminatory measures, and he even financed test cases in the courts. So we'll end there today, and we'll pick up in the next one with city bosses.